The neon lights outside the Orbit Diner flickered sporadically, casting a colorful glow through the rain-speckled windows. The diner, worn down and tinged with nostalgia, still managed to hold onto a charm that kept the regulars coming back. It wasn't upscale or trendy, but it had a certain grit that appealed to the truckers, mechanics, and wandering souls who stopped by from the nearby spaceport. That night, though, something was different. Mara had been working here for 7 years, and her shifts had long since fallen into a predictable rhythm. The same greasy food, the same weary faces. Balancing a tray of coffee refills, she moved from table to table, her mind on autopilot, until a shadow in the doorway caught her attention. She squinted, trying to make out the figure standing just beyond the entrance. Tall and gaunt, it seemed more a shape than a person, but as it stepped forward, it was joined by 2 others. Mara froze, eyes widening as the silhouettes clarified in the dim lighting. The newcomers weren't human. 3 aliens, each of a different hue, stood there surveying the diner. One had skin a deep red, another a dusty green, and the last a lighter, almost translucent green that seemed to emit a soft glow. Their glossy, black eyes scanned the room with an unreadable expression, yet something in their stance hinted at curiosity rather than threat. They appeared young and hesitant, as if uncertain about their place in this foreign setting. No one else seemed to notice them yet. The patrons remained absorbed in their conversations, their meals, their own little worlds. Mara's instincts kicked in, and she forced a steady breath, putting on her usual friendly smile as she approached them. Aliens weren't an unusual sight in this area, especially with the spaceport nearby. But these 3, they seemed unsure, almost like they were just figuring things out. She'd served all sorts of travelers before, diplomats, traders, explorers, but these didn't have the same hardened look. If anything, they reminded her of teenagers, slightly out of place and searching for guidance. "Hi there," she greeted with practiced warmth. "Looking for a spot to sit?" The aliens exchanged glances. Mara noted the subtle hesitation in their eyes, something almost shy. The red-skinned one gave a slow nod, attempting a smile that was more a gentle stretch of its lips than anything familiar. "Right this way," she said, gesturing to a booth near the window. The aliens followed her lead, moving with a graceful, yet slightly awkward gait. She handed them menus, noticing the way their large eyes darted between the pages and back to her, as if hoping for a bit of advice. "Feeling hungry?" she ventured, her voice easy. "We make some great fries here, best in this part of the galaxy." The red-skinned alien, whom Mara assumed to be the leader, exchanged a glance with the others, then nodded. "Great, I'll get that going for you." Mara jotted down their order: 3 plates of fries, a side of mashed vegetables, and a couple of glasses of water. She rushed back to the kitchen, her mind racing. Who were they, and why had they come to the Orbit Diner? They looked exhausted, maybe hungry, maybe lost. As the food sizzled on the griddle, Mara couldn't help but steal another look at their booth. The 3 aliens sat close together, moving in near unison but with a jittery tension, as if still adjusting to the strange atmosphere. When she brought over their plates, their reactions caught her off guard, nearly breaking her heart. The red-skinned one's eyes seemed to brighten, a soft glow emanating from his pupils, a flicker of hunger mixed with relief. The grayish-green one's hands shook slightly as he reached for his plate, clutching it as though it were something invaluable. The pale green one hesitated, then leaned forward, sniffing cautiously before taking a small, tentative bite. Once they tasted the food, a calmness washed over them. Mara watched, transfixed, as they ate slowly, savoring every bite. The food wasn't anything fancy, typical greasy diner fare, but to them, it seemed a rare delight. They ate in silence, and Mara couldn't shake the feeling that these kids had been through something difficult, something that left them not just hungry for food, but starved for a sense of peace, for a taste of the ordinary. She quietly refilled their water glasses, noticing how the red-skinned alien murmured softly to the others in a language that sounded like music. They responded in the same melodic tones, and Mara found herself wishing she could understand. That night marked the beginning of a new routine. For the next 2 years, those alien teenagers became regulars at the diner. Started with that first meal, which Mara didn't charge them for. She knew they didn't have credits. People with that level of desperation rarely did. And each time they returned, the scene was the same. No money, no explanations, just hopeful glances cast her way. And Mara, despite her own hesitation, always relented. At first, she questioned why she kept feeding them, why she allowed these alien kids to return night after night without expecting anything in return. But there was something about them, their quiet gratitude, the careful way they left the table spotless, the sense of isolation that mirrored her own youth when life had seemed cold and vast, and all she could do was find a way to get by. So Mara continued feeding them, keeping her kindness unspoken, hidden from the world. The diner diner wasn't busy enough for anyone to notice a few extra plates each night, and it wasn't putting her out. In a way, it became her own small way of looking out for them. But Mara hadn't expected that feeding those 3 aliens would alter her life so profoundly. One evening, just as they were finishing their usual meal, the red-skinned alien, the one she had come to think of as their leader, stood up, his large black eyes gleaming with an unfamiliar emotion. Regret, maybe? He reached into the folds of his thin, worn clothing and produced a small metallic object, no bigger than a coin, glowing softly with an otherworldly light. With delicate fingers, he placed it gently on the table, nudging it toward her. Mara hesitated, picking it up with care. It was warm, almost alive, with a faint pulse radiating through it. She looked at him, puzzled. "This is payment," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "For everything." Mara's brows knit together as she stared at the object, then back at him. "You don't owe me anything," she replied. "It was just a few meals." The red-skinned alien shook his head slowly, his expression serious. "You gave when we had nothing," he said. "Now we give back." She glanced at the other 2, who watched her with the same solemn intensity, their eyes catching the diner's neon glow. Mara didn't know what this object was. Alien currency, advanced technology, perhaps, but the way they looked at her told her it held deeper meaning. With a mix of reluctance and gratitude, she slipped the object into her apron pocket. "Thank you," she said softly, uncertain of what else to say. The red-skinned alien gave a small nod, and without another word, the 3 of them drifted out of the diner into the rain-soaked night. Mara watched them disappear, a strange emptiness settling over her. Who were they, really? And what was this glowing object they'd entrusted to her? More than curiosity, she felt an unexpected pang of something close to loss. Over time, feeding them had become a comforting ritual, and she wasn't prepared for the hole their absence would leave. The rain outside intensified, drumming steadily against the diner's roof like countless tiny heartbeats. Mara stood by the counter, fingers tracing the object's edges through her apron, trying to process the weight of the moment. The 3 teenagers, if they truly were that young, had slipped into her life and vanished just as quickly. But this object, it wasn't just some trinket. It seemed to pulse with something more, something that almost felt alive. "Mara, you okay?" Rick, the night cook, interrupted her thoughts. He leaned through the kitchen pass, watching her with a look of concern. His grizzled face, roughened by a few days' stubble, softened in worry. "You look like you've just seen a ghost." Mara managed a chuckle, though it sounded forced. "Something like that." Mara gave Rick a faint smile, but she couldn't tell him about the aliens. Not yet. For all she knew, the object might be a simple trinket, nothing more. But deep down, she felt certain it held meaning. How could she explain any of this to Rick, who saw the world through the reliable lens of bacon, eggs, and the occasional cup of black coffee? She tried to shake it off, keeping busy by tidying up. The doorbell jingled, startling her, but it was only Hank, the regular, a retired spacer who always stopped by for a late-night coffee before catching his shuttle to the orbital stations. He gave her a nod and settled into his usual booth, blissfully unaware of the strange encounter that had just unfolded. Mara poured his coffee, but her thoughts were distant, still lingering on the mysterious object in her pocket. It seemed heavier now, as if it connected her to something larger, something she couldn't yet define. Irrational as it felt, she couldn't shake the sense that this was just the beginning of something unknown. Later, after closing up, Mara walked home through the city's dim glow, blurred by the ongoing rain. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional hover car gliding by in the mist. Her apartment was modest, filled with stacks of old hollow discs and mementos from her younger days, back when she dreamed of leaving Earth for the stars. Those dreams had faded over time, buried beneath diner shifts and routine. Once inside, she placed the alien object on her kitchen table. It shimmered under the fluorescent lights, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. She stared at it, wondering if she should call someone, maybe the authorities or even the spaceport. But who would she even call for something like this? And would they believe her? Her thoughts drifted back to the 3 aliens. Why had they chosen the Orbit Diner? Why had they stayed for 2 years, sharing silent meals and relying on her small gestures of kindness? And why, after all this time, had they left her with this strange artifact? The questions swirled, but answers were elusive. Exhausted, Mara rubbed her temples, her mind too foggy to process any of it tonight. "Tomorrow," she muttered, closing her eyes briefly. "I'll sort it out tomorrow." The next morning brought no clarity. If anything, Mara felt even more unsettled. The object had stopped glowing, its once lively pulse now dormant, as if it had drained overnight. Yet yet its presence still weighed on her. She slipped it into her bag, feeling better about keeping it close. The morning shift started like any other. Regulars shuffled in, ordering pancakes and coffee, filling the diner with familiar sounds and smells. But Mara's mind kept wandering, preoccupied with the mysterious weight in her bag. Mid-morning, just as she refilled a customer's cup, a low, distinct hum reached her ears from outside. The sound grew louder, unmistakably the engine of a hovercraft. A sound she knew well, but this one had a distinct, official ring to it. Her heart skipped a beat. Mara wiped her hands on her apron, stepping toward the door just as it swung open. Two figures entered, and her stomach twisted with unease. They weren't entirely human. Their skin had an eerie translucence, and their large eyes dominated their angular faces. Clad in sleek, dark uniforms marked with the emblem of the Galactic Union Security Division, a branch that rarely ventured this far from the core planets unless something serious was involved. These agents radiated authority. The taller of the two, a silver-haired male, scanned the diner with cold, calculating eyes that eventually fixed on Mara. He moved toward her, and she noticed a slight shimmer in the air around him, likely a personal shield. The other agent, a female with piercing, hawk-like features, stood by the door, clearly positioned to block any chance of exit. Mara Hayes, the male asked, his voice smooth yet mechanical, as if speaking in Galactic Common was more an obligation than a choice. Mara felt her throat tighten, but she gave a slight nod. We're investigating certain individuals who have been frequenting this establishment, he continued, his tone making it clear this was far from a casual inquiry. 3 unregistered aliens within this sector. Her heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. I'm not sure what you're talking about. The female by the door let out a sharp scoff. Don't play games, Hayes. We have surveillance data from the spaceport. We know they've been here. Mara bit her lip, wondering if she should deny it again. But it was clear these agents weren't here to make idle threats. She couldn't dismiss the cold authority in their eyes. What do you want with them? She managed, her voice softer than she intended. The silver-haired agent tilted his head, as though calculating how much to share. They're criminals, Hayes, escaped from a high-security facility. Dangerous. You don't want to be aiding fugitives, do you? Dangerous. Her thoughts spun. The 3 aliens she'd been serving for the past 2 years had been anything but dangerous. They'd seemed vulnerable, even lost. She couldn't connect these gentle, awkward beings to the criminals he described. But the truth was, she knew nothing about their past, only the quiet gratitude they had shown for every meal. I haven't seen them in days, she replied truthfully, hoping it might buy her a little time. The male agent gave a slight, knowing nod. If they return, you'll report it at once. Non-compliance will result in severe consequences. He leaned in close, his gaze hardening. And trust me, you don't want to test us. Mara stood motionless as the agents turned and exited, their hovercraft fading into the rainy clouds. For a long moment, she just stood there, grappling with their words. Criminals, escaped, dangerous, but the pieces didn't add up. The way the 3 aliens had looked at her, the gratitude they'd shown, it didn't match the story she'd just been told. She reached into her bag, pulling out the small metallic object they had left with her. She stared at it, hoping it might somehow hold the answers she desperately needed. Nothing. That night, after her shift, Mara didn't head home. Instead, she wandered the streets near the spaceport, her eyes searching every shadowed alley and hidden corner. She didn't have a plan, didn't know where to begin, but she knew she had to find them. As she passed by a dim alley, a voice stopped her in her tracks. Mara, she turned sharply, her heart leaping into her throat. There, half hidden in the shadows, stood the red-skinned alien. Relief washed over her until she saw his condition. His once vibrant skin was dull, his posture slumped with exhaustion. You have to leave, he said in a low, strained voice. What's happening? She demanded, stepping closer. The Galactic Union agents came to the diner. They said they're lying. He cut her off, pain lacing his voice. We're not criminals, Mara, but they'll say whatever it takes to get what they want. Mara's brow furrowed. And what is it they want? He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to see the agents closing in. Then, from within his tattered clothing, he withdrew another small object, identical to the one he'd given her before. Thereafter this, he said, pressing it into her hand. What we gave you, it's more than just payment. It's the key to everything. She looked down at the glowing object, its soft light now pulsing in rhythm with her racing heartbeat. She didn't fully understand, but a sense of gravity settled over her, heavy and unshakable. What am I supposed to do with it? She whispered. Before he could answer, the faint hum of a hovercraft engine echoed down the alley. The alien's eyes widened, fear flashing across his face. Run, he hissed, vanishing into the shadows as swiftly as he'd appeared, leaving her alone with the second glowing object in her hand. The engine noise grew louder, slicing through the quiet night night like a hunter closing in. The artifact in Mara's hand pulsed, its light echoing the frantic beat of her heart. She was out of time. Every instinct told her to run. But where? She didn't know where to go, and she barely understood the objects she now carried. Her mind spun with the enormity of it all. She was no hero, just a waitress who'd scraped by, feeding strangers out of kindness, or maybe foolishness. And now, she held something powerful enough to draw the Galactic Union's elite agents, dangerous enough for them to hunt down a few desperate kids to claim it. She glanced back into the alley where the red-skinned alien had disappeared, swallowed by shadows. He'd told her to run, but how could she possibly escape from something like this? But standing still wasn't an option. The hovercraft's engine settled into a low whine just around the corner. Without a second thought, Mara shoved the second glowing object deep into her bag and bolted in the opposite direction. Rain lashed against her face, cold and unrelenting, as she tore through the narrow streets, her heart pounding in her chest. The city seemed to work against her with every step. The wet pavement was slick underfoot, forcing her to move cautiously, no matter how desperately she wanted to sprint. Hover cars sped by in the distance, their headlights casting fleeting reflections across puddles scattered along her path. Every few seconds, she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting the Union agents to materialize from the mist like phantoms. But all she saw was rain and the blurred glow of city lights. Her apartment was just a few blocks away, but going there would be a dead giveaway. If the agents knew where she worked, they'd quickly figure out where she lived. She needed a place to disappear, somewhere they wouldn't expect to find her. Then it hit her, the spaceport. With its daily influx of thousands of people from every corner of the galaxy, it was chaotic enough to keep her hidden. The spaceport's bustling terminal became her refuge. The smells of foreign foods mingled with the sounds of countless languages, blending into a backdrop of constant motion. Usually, Mara found comfort here, a reminder that her small world at the diner was just a speck in a universe full of possibility. Today, she relied on the crowd's density to shield her from pursuit. She slipped into a terminal, shaking off her soaked jacket as she merged with the crowd. The heavy hum of shuttles departing vibrated through the walls, while the announcement system crackled with updates on delayed flights. Keeping her head down, she moved toward one of the side terminals where transport shuttles to the orbital stations docked. Her bag felt impossibly heavy on her shoulder, the alien objects inside seeming to amplify their presence with each step. What were they? She hadn't had time to ask, and even if she had, would the red-skinned alien have told her everything? He'd only said one thing that stuck in her mind. It's the key to everything. The words echoed as she slipped into the shadows behind a row of cargo crates near a loading dock. She crouched down, catching her breath as the gravity of her situation sank in. Her life had always been simple. She'd liked it that way, or so she told herself. Keep things straightforward and people leave you alone. But now, here she was, swept into something enormous and mysterious, all because she couldn't turn away 3 lost kids in need of a meal. What had her kindness cost her? Leaning back against a crate, she pulled the 2 alien artifacts from her bag. They glowed softly, their light pulsing in sync, like 2 hearts beating together. The discs didn't look remarkable, small, metallic, with intricate, almost organic patterns etched across their surfaces. But the weight they carried wasn't physical. It was something far heavier, something dangerous. For a moment, Mara considered just leaving them here, walking away and letting the Union, or whoever else wanted them, deal with it. She hadn't asked for any of this. It wasn't her problem. But guilt prickled at her, and her mind flashed to the red-skinned alien, his exhausted eyes and the fear in his voice when he told her to run. They were still out there, probably in far greater danger than she was, and whatever these objects were, they mattered enough for them to risk their lives. Could she really just walk away? A hand suddenly clamped down on her shoulder, pulling her abruptly from her thoughts. She gasped, spinning around to find herself staring into the face of Hank, the old spacer who'd been a regular at the diner for as long as she could remember. His usual friendly eyes were now sharp with suspicion, and his grip was firm, almost too firm. "Mara, what the hell is going on?" he demanded, casting a quick glance around them as if checking for eavesdroppers. "You're in deep trouble, aren't you?" She pulled her arm free, stepping back. "How did you?" "I've been watching ever since those Union agents showed up at the diner," he interrupted. "I knew something was wrong the moment they came around asking questions. Then I saw you take off from there like your life depended on it. So what's going on?" Mara hesitated. She'd always thought of Hank as harmless, just a regular customer. But the intensity in his gaze, the way he'd tracked her here, something felt off. "I don't know," she said, forcing a lie, slipping the artifacts back into her bag. "I don't know anything." Hank's eyes narrowed, his mouth curling into a thin, humorless line. "Don't kid yourself, Mara. I know what you're carrying." A chill ran through her. "What are you talking about?" He stepped closer, his voice voice dropping to a near whisper. Those things in your bag aren't just alien junk. They're high-level tech, the kind people would kill for. Black market stuff. I don't know how you got tangled up in this, but I've seen things like this before, and it's serious trouble. Mara's pulse raced. How do you know that? He leaned in, the faint smell of the cheap coffee he always ordered lingering on his breath. Because I used to run in those circles before I retired to this dirtball of a planet. There are people out there, dangerous people, who would do anything to get their hands on what you've got. Her mind reeled. I didn't ask for this. I was just trying to help. Hank shook his head, a flash of pity crossing his face. That's the problem, Mara. You didn't ask for it, but now you're in the middle of it, and there's no easy way out. A tense silence settled between them, broken only by the distant hum of engines and the soft murmur of travelers passing through the terminal. Mara's fingers tightened around her bag, her knuckles turning white. I have to get out of here, Mara muttered, half to herself. But Hank caught her arm again, this time with a gentler grip. You won't make it out on your own, he said quietly. They'll find you. Odds are they're already close. But I can help you. Mara hesitated, instincts flaring with distrust. Why would you help me? Hank gave her a small, wry smile. Let's just say I owe you one. You've been giving me free refills for years, haven't you? Despite herself, Mara almost laughed. The absurdity of it all. Galactic Union agents on her heels, dangerous alien tech in her bag, and here was Hank, stepping in as if a few cups of cheap coffee somehow made up for it. Fine, she said, her voice hardening with resolve. But we need to move now, they're closing in. Hank nodded, gesturing for her to follow as he led her through the quieter back corridors of the spaceport. The lights were dim, and the crowds thinned, allowing them to move more discreetly. Mara kept her head down, following him in silence, her thoughts racing to make sense of it all. They emerged in a shadowed maintenance bay where a small, battered transport shuttle idled. Hank motioned her toward it, but before she could climb aboard, a voice rang out from the darkness. Going somewhere? Mara's heart froze. Standing at the entrance was the silver-haired Union agent, his cold eyes fixed on her with predatory intent. Behind him, the female agent stepped forward, her hand resting on the holster of her weapon. Hank positioned himself between Mara and the agents, his body a shield. You're making a mistake, he called out, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. The silver-haired agent tilted his head, a smirk tugging at his lips. I don't think so. Hand over the artifacts, and everyone here gets to walk away. Mara's heart hammered. She knew, without a doubt, that the moment she handed over the artifacts, they would kill her, Hank, and anyone else in their way. I don't have them, she lied, her voice quivering despite her attempt to sound resolute. The agent's smile faded, and for a moment, she thought her bluff might hold. But then the female agent drew her weapon, aiming it at Hank's chest. You want to keep testing us, sweetheart? She taunted, her tone dripping with disdain. Hank didn't flinch. You're not going to shoot, he said, calm and unshaken. Not when you need us alive. The silver-haired agent's smile returned, sharper than before. Maybe not, but we don't need both of you. Before Mara could react, a deafening crack filled the air, and Hank crumpled to the ground, blood pooling around him. No, she cried, rushing to his side, but it was too late. The female agent holstered her weapon, a cold satisfaction glinting in her eyes. Last chance, the silver-haired agent said, stepping forward. Hand over the artifacts, or the next one's for you. Mara looked down at Hank's lifeless form, her mind reeling. Everything she thought she knew about herself, about the world, collapsed in that instant. She'd believed in doing the right thing, in helping people, in keeping a low profile to avoid trouble. But none of it mattered now. Hank was dead because of her. The only way to survive now was to fight back, to abandon the rules she'd always followed. Her fingers tightened around the bag as she slowly stood, meeting the agent's gaze with newfound resolve. You want them? She said, her voice steady. The agent raised an eyebrow, visibly intrigued by her sudden defiance. Come and get them. Without hesitation, Mara flung the bag into the transport shuttle's engine intake, watching as the two glowing objects disappeared into the fiery maw of its exhaust. The agent's eyes widened in shock, and for the first time, Mara saw something unexpected: fear. The engine roared, consuming the artifacts in flames, and a strange calm washed over her, like standing in the eye of a storm. She had made her choice. Disbelief twisted across the silver-haired agent's face before it cracked into pure rage. His hand hovered over his weapon, but he hesitated. You have no idea what you've done, he spat, his voice laced with venom. Mara held her ground, fists clenched. I'm done playing along. If you want those artifacts, go dig them out of a jet engine. The female agent growled in frustration, moving forward, but the silver-haired agent raised his hand to stop her. Wait, he murmured, his gaze fixed on Mara with a shift in perspective. He no longer saw her as some insignificant waitress caught in a bigger game. He now regarded her with a reluctant instant respect, the respect one reserves for an unexpected adversary. "Do you even know what those artifacts were?" he asked. Mara swallowed, but her voice remained steady. "I know they were important enough for you to kill for." The agent's lips curled into a thin, cruel smile. "Important doesn't begin to describe them. Those artifacts were pieces of an ancient network, a map. They led to a power so old, so vast, it makes the Galactic Union look like a gang of petty thieves. What you destroyed was the key to unlocking that power. Now it's lost forever." A heavy silence filled the air, punctuated only by the distant hum of the spaceport's engines and the low whir of the shuttle beside them. The weight of what she had done began to sink in. Had she just prevented an ancient, apocalyptic force from being unleashed, or had she sealed the galaxy's fate by destroying the only thing that could control it? But there was no time to dwell on it. She needed to bring this to an end. "So that's it," she demanded, her gaze unwavering. "You wanted power, and those kids, what were they? Just pawns in your scheme?" The agent's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, something flashed within them. Something like frustration, even desperation. "Those kids, as you call them, weren't innocent. They were thieves. They stole the artifacts from us, intending to sell them to the highest bidder." The agent sneered. "We were trying to prevent them from tearing apart the fabric of everything." Mara's fists clenched tighter. "I don't believe you. I saw them. They were starving, terrified. Whatever they took, it wasn't about profit. It was survival." The agent's smile returned, thin and joyless. "You're naive. You think everyone who looks vulnerable is good. That's why people like you end up dead, caught up in things you don't understand." Mara's mind raced, but one question stood out, gnawing at her. Why had those kids come to her of all people? Why the diner? And then it hit her like a freight train. They hadn't chosen her because they trusted her. They'd chosen her because they knew she wouldn't understand what the artifacts were. She'd been the perfect cover, a simple, unsuspecting human in a forgotten corner of the galaxy who wouldn't ask too many questions. The realization was bitter, but it also felt strangely freeing. She had been a pawn in this game, yes, but so had everyone else. And now the game was over, with no winners left. Her gaze hardened as she met the agent's eyes. "It doesn't matter anymore. It's done. They're gone. You won't get what you want." For a moment, the agent looked like he might strike her, his hand twitching toward his weapon. But then, as if reaching a grim conclusion, he straightened and looked at the female agent. "We're done here." The female agent's expression flickered with confusion. "But she's right," the silver-haired agent interrupted. "It's over. The artifacts are destroyed. We've lost our leverage." A strange mix of relief and dread washed over Mara. They were really going to leave. She was going to survive this, but at a heavy cost. Hank was dead, the aliens were gone, and whatever ancient power those artifacts held was lost forever. The female agent threw Mara a last, venomous glare before turning back toward the hovercraft. The silver-haired agent lingered, his gaze scanning Mara's face as if searching for something. "Remember this, Mara," he said, his tone low and menacing. "You think you've won something here, but all you've done is ensure that when the next threat comes, no one will be ready. You destroyed the only thing that could have stopped it." Without waiting for a response, he turned and joined his partner in the hovercraft. The vehicle lifted off, the roar of its engines fading as it disappeared into the night sky. For a long moment, Mara stood there, staring at the empty space where the hovercraft had vanished. The rain had stopped, but the night felt colder and lonelier than ever. The hum of the spaceport activity carried on around her, distant and detached, as if the world had moved on and left her behind. She looked down at Hank's still form, a surge of guilt tightening her chest. He hadn't deserved this. None of it. Kneeling beside him, she gently closed his eyes. "I'm sorry, Hank," she whispered. "I didn't know," Mara whispered, brushing the rain from her face. The weight of everything bore down on her. The choices she'd made, the lives lost, the truth she had realized far too late. Yet, amidst the heaviness, there was an odd clarity, a sense of finality. The brutal, chaotic game was over. She had done all she could, winning in her own small way. A week later, Mara was back at the diner. The familiar sounds of clinking silverware and the sizzle of the griddle filled the air, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as if nothing had changed. The regulars came and went. Rick shouted orders from the kitchen, and life moved on. But Mara knew everything had changed. She kept to herself, avoiding the friendly chats she once indulged in with the customers. Word had spread about the strange incident at the spaceport, but no one connected it to her. She told the authorities that Hank had been killed in a robbery gone wrong, and they had accepted it without question, just another casualty in a restless city. As she wiped down a table by the window, Mara glanced out onto the street. A group of kids passed by, laughing and playfully shoving each other. For a moment, her mind drifted to the three aliens, the red-skinned one's solemn eyes, the way they had devoured her meals night after night. She didn't know where they were now. Perhaps they were dead, or maybe they had managed to escape. But in the end, it didn't matter. She had done what she could. She had survived. Somehow, that had to be enough. As she cleared the last of the plates, she felt something brush against her leg. Frowning, she looked down to see an old, worn coin lying on the floor. It wasn't hers, and it wasn't from this world. She picked it up, her heart skipping a beat. The intricate, organic patterns on its surface were unmistakable, just like the artifacts she had destroyed. But this coin wasn't glowing. It was old, tarnished, as though it had been forgotten for centuries. For a long moment, Mara simply stared at it, feeling the heavy weight of the coin in her hand. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, she slipped it into her apron pocket. No one else noticed, no one else would care, but Mara understood. She didn't know how or why, but she knew one thing for certain. This was the end. Not just for her, not just for the aliens or the Galactic Union, but for whatever ancient power had been locked away, for whatever invisible game had been unfolding behind the scenes. It was over. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mara could breathe. The final chapter had been written. There were no more questions, no more mysteries, just a quiet diner, an ordinary life, and the knowledge that sometimes the world didn't need heroes or saviors. Sometimes it just needed someone to make a choice, and she had made hers. The end.